Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The August morning rose over the Burrow as August mornings in this remarkable family typically did, with the scent of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen through cracked windows, with sunlight streaming through gaps in the crooked shutters, and with that particular feeling of summer coziness when it seems the day will last forever and all worries can wait until tomorrow. The Burrow stuck up among the fields like an enormous gingerbread house that someone had tried to bake but forgotten about balance and symmetry. Several floors, added one to another by magic and love, held together rather by charms than by common sense. In the highest room of the Burrow, where the twins Fred and George slept, the first rays of sun were already breaking through the orange-colored curtains that Molly Weasley had sewn by hand last winter. The 11-year-old boys slept in their beds, sprawled in such identical poses that even in sleep they resembled mirror reflections of each other. On the floor between the beds lay various parchments with amusing drawings, diagrams of incomprehensible devices, and notes such as, "Exploding Treacle version 3, the previous one exploded." One floor below, in his tidy room, Percy Weasley had already woken and sat at his desk, absorbed in reading Preliminary Course of Transfiguration for the 3rd year. The 13-year-old boy was extremely proud that he had been allowed to take the textbook home for the summer, and he diligently took notes on each chapter, his glasses sliding down to the tip of his nose from concentration. Percy had already managed to get dressed. Even at home he wore a collared shirt, because in his opinion, a real wizard should look decent under any circumstances. Even lower, in the room he shared with his younger brother Ron, Charlie Weasley woke from 9-year-old Ron, kicking him in his sleep. The 17-year-old Charlie stretched, his muscles aching pleasantly from yesterday's work in the garden. Strong from Quidditch. He had just finished Hogwarts and planned to leave for Romania soon to work with dragons, but for now he was helping the family around the house. His red hair stuck up in all directions, a sleepy smile spreading across his face. Charlie loved mornings at the Burrow. It was always noisy, cozy, and smelled of something delicious. In the smallest room, more like a spacious closet, 8-year-old Ginny Weasley slept, hugging her favorite rag doll. Her red hair spilled over the pillow in a golden waterfall, and a smile played on her face. She was probably having a wonderful dream. Downstairs, in the kitchen, Molly Weasley had long since risen, and was conjuring by the stove. Her wand waved back and forth with the precision of a maestro conducting an orchestra. Pans fried eggs on their own, a knife sliced bread into even pieces, and the kettle whistled just when the tea reached perfect strength. Molly was a short woman of pleasant roundness, with warm brown eyes that usually shone with kindness and love. Her red hair, gathered in a careless bun, had already managed to fluff up a bit from the morning bustle, and pink spots burned on her cheeks from the heat of the stove. She hummed to herself an old magical song about a cauldron brewing a love potion, when suddenly a quiet scraping came from the door. Molly looked around, and saw their old cat Tibbers squeezing through the cat flap that Arthur had enchanted last summer. The cat looked displeased and rather disheveled, clumps of earth stuck to his ginger and white fur, and a lettuce leaf was tangled in his whiskers. "Tibbers, what happened?" asked Molly, kneeling down to examine the cat more closely. She pulled out her wand and whispered, "Tergio." The dirt vanished from Tibbers' fur, but the cat continued to meow angrily, looking at the door leading to the garden. Something in his behavior alerted Molly. She straightened up, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked decisively to the door. Opening it, she stepped onto the threshold and froze. Her garden, her wonderful well-tended garden, on which she had spent so much time and love, looked as if a herd of hippogriffs had trampled through it. The cabbage beds were dug up, young tomatoes lay on the ground with bitten sides, and her beloved currant bushes had only bare branches remaining. Everywhere dark holes gaped, entrances to gnome burrows. And worst of all, from some of the holes peeked the gnomes themselves, their potato-like heads with cunning little eyes watching Molly with impudent disregard. One particularly large gnome sitting right in the middle of the ruined carrot bed was gnawing on a young carrot and keeping his eyes on Molly the whole time. His skin had a special brownish-green tint, and something like a tuft of dried grass grew on his head. He looked older and cleverer than ordinary gnomes, and in his small black eyes gleamed unexpected intelligence. "Ger off me," hissed the gnome, showing a row of sharp, yellowed teeth. Molly felt something hot and furious boiling in her chest. This wasn't just anger, it was the righteous fury of a housewife who had seen months of her labor destroyed in one night. She clenched her fists, her face reddened and her eyes blazed with such fire that even the most impudent gnome fearfully hid in his burrow. "Charlie, Percy, Fred, George!" Her voice rang out so loudly that a flock of sparrows rose in fright from the garden. "Get down here now!" Pandemonium erupted in the burrow. Charlie jumped up from bed so sharply he hit his head on the low ceiling. Percy dropped his quill, which left a long ink stain on his notes. Fred and George tumbled out of their beds almost simultaneously, tangling in their blankets. Even little Ron woke and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand whether it was an earthquake or just Mum being very, very angry. A minute later, 4 boys were already standing in the kitchen doorway, dressed to varying degrees and rumpled, looking at Molly, who stood in the middle of the garden, pointing at the destruction. "Look," Molly's voice trembled with indignation. "Look what these blasted gnomes have done to my garden. I spent all of June and July tending these beds. I watered, fertilized, loosened the soil every day. And now, there's such a mess that even Ernie Puckett's cows look tidier." Charlie stared at the devastation. Percy tucked his shirt into his trousers, trying to look composed. Fred and George exchanged glances. Their faces were a mirror reflection of excited curiosity, mixed with slight horror. "This is truly terrible, Mum," Percy began carefully, adjusting his glasses. "But perhaps if we just... Molly interrupted him, her voice rising an octave higher. "I'll tell you what you'll do just. You'll deal with these gnomes and get rid of them once and for all. Do you hear me? Once and for all." "Yes, Ma'am, Mrs. General," Fred muttered, but quietly enough that Mum didn't hear. "We'll handle it, Mum," Charlie assured her, stepping closer to the garden. "Look, there aren't that many of them. We'll throw them out, and that'll be that." "I've read about methods of expelling gnomes," Percy added importantly. "In Gilderoy Lockhart's book, Guide to Household Pests, it describes in detail." "Forget about Lockhart," Charlie interrupted him. "We'll do it the old way. Grab, spin, throw." "Simple and effective." Molly crossed her arms over her chest and scrutinized her sons. "All right. But I'm warning you, if by evening these gnomes haven't disappeared, I'll take matters into my own hands. And then you'd better hide in your rooms and not stick your noses out until morning." There was something in her voice that made all 4 boys involuntarily swallow. They knew well that when Mum spoke in that tone, it was better to do everything as she said. "Don't worry, Mum," said George, smiling his most charming smile. "By evening there won't be a single gnome here. Not even their spirit will remain," Fred added. Molly gave them one more skeptical look, then turned and went back to the kitchen. Through the door came her voice. "And don't forget to put on gloves. I don't want to treat you for gnome bites afterward." When the door closed, the 4 boys exchanged glances. "Well then," Charlie clapped his hands, "let's show these potato heads who's boss here." They armed themselves with old torn gloves that Molly kept in the cupboard by the door. Percy even grabbed a notebook and quill. He decided to document the process for future analysis of effectiveness. Fred and George each took a stick, not magical but ordinary wooden ones, to pry up stones near the burrows. "Right," Charlie commanded, naturally taking the role of leader. "The plan is simple. We surround the beds, pull out the gnomes, spin them properly and throw them over the hedge. They won't be able to come back quickly if they're dizzy." "Sounds like a plan," Percy agreed, writing something in his notebook. The first gnome didn't make them wait long. He crawled out of a burrow under the currant bush, dragging a whole green berry behind him. His small horny feet patted amusingly on the ground, and his potato-like head swiveled looking around. "I'll get him," George shouted and rushed forward, but the gnome proved quicker than he seemed. He threw the berry right in George's face and scurried toward the next burrow. George, blinking, ran after him but tripped over a root and fell right into the cabbage bed. "Elegant," Fred commented, trying not to laugh. "Shut up and help," George groaned, untangling himself from the cabbage. Meanwhile, Charlie had already managed to grab another gnome, that same big one with the carrot. The gnome screamed desperately and tried to bite Charlie's fingers, but the sturdy torn gloves protected his hands. Charlie grabbed the gnome by the ankles, lifted him up, and began spinning him overhead like a lasso. 1, 2, 3. He counted the rotations. The gnome screeched something that sounded like a mixture of "Get off me" and very rude words that he had probably learned from one of the older Weasley brothers. 4, 5, 6, 7. Charlie released the gnome's ankles. It flew 20 feet into the air and landed with a thud in the field beyond the hedge. Somewhere far away in the field came a quiet thump. "Good throw," Percy approved, writing something like, "First gnome, 7 rotations, flight approximately 15 meters." The next half hour turned into real chaos. Gnomes crawled out of their burrows one after another, and each was cleverer than the last. One gnome waited until Percy bent down to write something in his notebook and bit him on the calf. Percy screamed so loudly that the sparrows took flight from the garden again. Fred and George tried to catch one particularly fast gnome, but it led them around the elderberry bush for so long that the twins collided foreheads and fell to the ground, seeing stars. Charlie proved to be the most effective gnome catcher. He worked methodically: grab, spin, throw, next. His experience as a Quidditch seeker served him well. He had quick reflexes and good coordination. In the first hour he threw out at least 20 gnomes. When the sun rose higher and began to bake, the boys were already getting tired. They had thrown off their shirts, their faces were red from exertion, and their hands were covered with scratches despite the gloves. Percy had set aside his notebook because he couldn't keep up with the recording. Fred and George had organized a competition for who could throw a gnome farther, and had already managed to quarrel 3 times over who had won. Finally, around noon, the last visible gnome flew over the hedge. The boys stood among the devastated garden, breathing heavily and wiping sweat from their foreheads. "Well, that seems to be all of them," said Charlie, looking around. "I counted 42 gnomes," Percy reported, looking into his notebook. "Charlie threw 21, I threw 9, Fred 7, George 5. "That's not fair," George protested. "That last one was clearly mine." "But I threw it," Fred objected. "Only because you got in my way," Charlie laughed and slapped both twins on the shoulders. "Doesn't matter, boys. The main thing is, we managed. Now let Mum see what good boys we are." They went to the house, leaving behind an empty though somewhat scattered garden. Molly met them on the threshold with a jug of cold pumpkin juice and a plate of biscuits. "Well then, did you manage?" she asked, looking at their sweaty faces. "Yes, Mum," Charlie answered proudly. 42 gnomes, threw them all out." Molly glanced skeptically at the garden. "We'll see." They had lunch. Then Charlie helped his father in the shed, Percy returned to his textbooks, and Fred and George disappeared to their attic, from where soon came the sounds of chemical experiments. In the evening, when the sun was already tilting toward the horizon, painting the sky in golden pink shades, Ginny ran into the kitchen where Molly was preparing dinner. "Mum! Mum!" she squealed. "There are gnomes in the garden again!" Molly set down the knife she was using to chop onions and went to the threshold. What she saw made her lips press into a thin line. Through the garden scampered at least 50 gnomes. They weren't just returning, they were throwing a real celebration. Several gnomes were dancing some strange dance around the remains of the cabbage bed. Others were digging new burrows. And that big gnome, the one Charlie had thrown first, sat on a pile of ruined tomatoes eating a carrot, looking straight at Molly. "Charlie! Percy! Fred! George!" The boys appeared instantly, and their faces turned sour when they saw the picture in the garden. But we threw them all out," Percy protested. "I personally counted 42. "It seems they came back," Charlie stated grimly, "and brought friends." Well then, Molly sighed, it seems you need to try something else. But it's late now. Tomorrow morning you'll tackle them seriously. But for now, come, have dinner. At dinner, Arthur Weasley appeared. He worked at the Ministry of Magic in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, and usually returned home tired but cheerful. Today he looked especially pleased. He had probably managed to find some particularly interesting enchanted Muggle object. "What's with the long faces?" he asked, kissing Molly on the cheek and sitting at the table. "Gnomes," Molly answered shortly, serving him stewed cabbage with potatoes. "Ah, gnomes," Arthur nodded. "Infested again? Don't worry, I'll help you now. I have one wonderful spell that I picked up from a mug. I recently learned it. Remember Percival Dieter from the Magical Catastrophes Department? Well, he was telling me." "Arthur," Molly began carefully. "Perhaps you shouldn't. The boys have already managed halfway." "Nonsense," Arthur waved his hand. "Now I'll show them how to expel gnomes with magic." After dinner, when dusk was already falling over the garden, Arthur went to the threshold, pulled out his wand and majestically pronounced, "Repello insolens." From the tip of his wand burst bright blue light that spread in waves across the garden. For a moment it seemed the spell had worked. The gnomes froze, staring at the magical light. But then, something strange began. Instead of running away, the gnomes began to glow. In the twilight, their potato-like heads began to emit a soft greenish glow that became brighter and brighter. They looked at each other in surprise, then began to screech joyfully. "Arthur, what have you done?" Molly was horrified. I'm not entirely sure," Arthur answered sheepishly, hiding his wand. "Perhaps I mixed up the spell a bit, or the pronunciation wasn't quite right, or now we have glowing gnomes." Charlie finished for him, hiding a smile. Indeed, the gnomes now resembled little green lanterns running around the garden. They seemed delighted with their new condition and threw a real disco, dancing, jumping and screeching with joy. Even the subtle movements could dramatically improve user engagement. "Wonderful," Molly muttered. "Now they also glow." "Arthur Weasley, sometimes I don't understand how you even work at the ministry." "Actually, it's quite beautiful," Percy remarked timidly, looking at the dancing green lights. "Beautiful or not, but they're still gnomes in my garden," Molly said decisively. "And tomorrow, you boys will find a way to get rid of them, even if they glow like a Christmas tree." That evening, when everyone was already going to bed, in the garden the gnome celebration continued. Their green lights flickered in the darkness, and if you listened, you could hear a quiet "Jeremy" and joyful screeching. And in the master bedroom Molly lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the situation. She loved her boys, but sometimes they were so short-sighted. Gnomes aren't expelled with one swipe. Gnomes are stubbornness, cunning, creatures that can adapt to anything. "If tomorrow they don't manage again," thought Molly, "I'll have to take matters into my own hands. And then these gnomes will see what real Weasley magic is." Beside her, Arthur snored, and his wand on the bedside table still faintly shimmered with blue light, a reminder of his unsuccessful experiment. Outside the window, the gnomes' green lights danced in the night, and it seemed they knew something the Weasley family didn't know. Something about the fact that this war for the garden was only beginning, and that the next day would bring even more adventures, attempts, and, perhaps, disasters. The big gnome, their unofficial leader, sat on the highest pile of earth, near the remains of the carrot bed. He no longer glowed. The spell somehow hadn't affected him. He looked at the dark windows of the burrow with his small, intelligent eyes, and was thinking something over in his potato-like head. People thought gnomes were simple creatures, but this gnome knew otherwise. He had been here long before the Weasleys built their ramshackle house. He remembered when this field was just a field, and he wasn't going to give up so easily, even against an army of red-haired wizards. "Let them try again," thought the gnome, gnawing the last piece of carrot. "We'll see who's the real master here." And with that, the first day of the great battle for the Weasley garden came to an end. The next morning Percy woke earlier than everyone else. The sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon, painting the sky in delicate shades of peach and pink, when he was already sitting at his desk, surrounded by a pile of books. Before him lay a worn copy of Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests, which he had requested from his mother last week when he first noticed the gnomes in the garden. Percy pushed his glasses higher on his nose and turned the page. His finger slid along the lines, and his lips soundlessly repeated the words. Chapter 5: Garden Gnomes, A Complete Guide to Eradication. Lockhart wrote in his usual refined style, each sentence full of confidence and promises of instant success. Garden gnomes, Percy read, are undoubtedly among the simplest pests to eliminate if one applies the correct approach. I personally developed a method I call the Lockhart Golden Standard, and it has never failed me. All you need is a firm hand, clear diction, and, naturally, innate charisma that will make even the most stubborn gnomes flee in terror. Percy wrinkled his nose doubtfully. Charisma? How could charisma help against gnomes? But he continued reading. Lockhart claimed one needed to stand in the center of the garden at dawn, when gnomes are least active, and loudly, with a sense of self-worth, pronounce a special spell he had supposedly invented himself during travels in Transylvania. Gnomus Despario Maximus, proclaimed Lockhart from the pages. Pronounce clearly, with faith in yourself, and no gnome will dare remain on your territory. Percy copied the spell into his notebook, then continued reading. Lockhart proposed several more methods, arranging specially enchanted stones around the garden that supposedly emit an unpleasant sound for gnomes, using a decoction of nettle and garlic that should be sprayed around the perimeter, and even a recommendation to recite self-composed poetry, because the beauty of words can touch even the primitive soul of a gnome. Poetry, Percy muttered to himself. Well, that's too much. But he still wrote everything down in his notebook. Percy was a perfectionist, and if he undertook something, he did it thoroughly. He decided to prepare all of Lockhart's methods for Charlie to try them one by one, systematically, with proper documentation of results. When the others woke and came down to the kitchen for breakfast, Percy was already standing by the door, dressed, with his notebook under his arm, and a serious expression on his face. "Good morning," he said solemnly. "I've developed a detailed plan for eliminating the gnomes, based on proven methods from a leading expert." Fred and George exchanged glances, chewing their toast. "Leading expert," Fred repeated suspiciously. "That's not Lockhart by any chance." "What's wrong with Lockhart?" Percy was offended. "He's the author of 7 bestsellers about fighting dark creatures. He's also the author of the most inflated ego in the wizarding world," George muttered. "Oh, come off it." Percy adjusted his glasses. "Charlie, are you with me? You'll have to use magic since I'm still underage." Charlie was finishing his tea and smiled. "Why not? If your method works, I'll only be glad." They went out to the garden, where the greenish gnomes were still sleeping, curled up in their burrows. The light from yesterday's spell by Arthur had almost disappeared, leaving only a faint shimmer on several particularly stubborn gnomes. Percy opened his notebook and began instructing Charlie. "So, the first spell is called Gnomus Despario Maximus. Lockhart states it must be pronounced loudly, with a sense of self-worth and innate charisma." "Charisma?" Charlie raised an eyebrow mockingly. "Against gnomes." "That's what's written in the book," Percy insisted. "Try it, please." Charlie stood in the center of the garden, squared his shoulders, and drew his wand. He took a deep breath, trying to look as charismatic as possible. "Gnomus Despario Maximus," he proclaimed as loudly and expressively as he could. From the tip of his wand flew a thin trickle of bluish smoke that slowly dissipated in the air. Nothing else happened. The gnomes continued to sleep. "Perhaps it needs to be repeated," Percy suggested, noting something in his notebook. Charlie repeated the spell. Then again. And again. On the 5th time, one of the gnomes crawled out of a burrow, yawned, showing sharp teeth, looked at Charlie as if he were an insignificant obstacle, and hid again. "Seems your charisma doesn't work on him," Fred joked, watching from the doorway along with George. "Shut up," Percy muttered, flipping through his notebook. "All right, moving on to method number 2. Enchanted stones." He scattered several stones around the garden, according to Lockhart's instructions, The stones were supposed to emit a high-frequency sound, inaudible to the human ear but unbearable for gnomes. Percy carefully placed the stones around the perimeter, then nodded to Charlie. "Now just activate them with a light wave of your wand," he explained. Charlie waved his wand over the stones. Again, nothing happened. The gnomes began waking up naturally, lazily crawling out of their burrows and looking around. One particularly curious gnome approached the nearest stone, sniffed it, then squatted and relieved himself on it. "Oh no," Percy groaned. "That's disrespect for science." "That's disrespect for Lockhart," George corrected, "which is entirely justified." Charlie patted Percy on the shoulder. "Don't be upset, let's try your nettle decoction." The nettle and garlic decoction Percy had prepared beforehand, carefully following the recipe from Lockhart's book. He sprayed it all around the garden perimeter, carefully following the instructions. The liquid was greenish-brown in color and smelled so revolting that even Charlie, who was used to various smells of magical creatures, grimaced. "If this doesn't scare away the gnomes, it'll at least scare away all of us," he remarked. The decoction didn't work either. Moreover, the gnomes seemed to find it interesting. Several of them specifically came to smell the wet spots, and one even tried to lick the ground soaked with the decoction, after which he joyfully screeched something like, "Yummy!" "That's it," Percy said gloomily, closing Lockhart's book. "These methods don't work. Either Lockhart's a liar, or the Weasley gnomes are somehow special." "Or both options," Fred added. Meanwhile, Fred and George hadn't been sitting idle. The twins always approached problems creatively, and the gnome problem was an ideal opportunity for them to test some of their experimental inventions. "What do you say, Fred?" George asked when they climbed to their attic. "I say, George, that we have a wonderful opportunity to test our sticky stickum," Fred answered, pulling from under the bed a suspicious-looking flask with orange liquid. Sticky stickum was one of the twins' first inventions. The idea was simple: create a substance so sticky that anything that touched it would stick forever, or at least long enough to be able to calmly throw it over the hedge. "Brilliant!" George clapped his hands. "We smear this near the burrow entrances, the gnomes crawl out, stick, and we collect them like apples." "The image is slightly disgusting, but the essence is correct," Fred agreed. They went down to the garden with the flask of sticky stickum. Percy and Charlie had already retreated, discussing the failures of previous attempts. Fred and George, without explaining anything, began carefully smearing the orange substance around the largest gnome burrows. "What's that?" Percy asked suspiciously. "Our secret ingredient," George answered mysteriously. "It won't explode," Charlie clarified, remembering the twins' previous experiments. "Unlikely," Fred said. "Well, in theory it shouldn't." "In theory isn't very reassuring," Percy muttered. But the twins had already finished their application and stepped back, watching. In a few minutes a gnome began crawling out of one of the burrows. He yawned sleepily, stuck out one hand, then the other, and... "Eh?" The gnome tried to pull out his hand, but it was stuck in the sticky stickum. "It's working!" George exclaimed joyfully. The gnome jerked harder, then even harder. He began screeching, calling other gnomes for help. And here's where the plan went sideways. Other gnomes, hearing their companions cry, crawled out of their burrows. But instead of also getting stuck, they saw the problem and began acting in an organized manner. One gnome brought a stick, another a burdock leaf, a third. "Wait, where did he get a bucket of water?" "They have a bucket?" Charlie asked in surprise. "That's my bucket from the shed," Percy was indignant. The gnomes began pouring water on the sticky stickum. The substance began to bubble and hiss, then suddenly exploded in a fountain of multicolored foam bubbles that flew in all directions. The twins, who were standing closest, were showered from head to toe with sticky orange foam. "Oi!" Fred cried, trying to wipe the foam from his face, but only smearing it more. "This is disgusting," George wailed, spitting out bubbles. The foam turned out to be not just sticky, it also stank of rotten cabbage. The gnomes, meanwhile, were joyfully jumping around the bubble fountain, screeching with delight, and even dancing some primitive victory dance. "Your inventions are getting better and better," Percy remarked sarcastically, stepping back from the bubble chaos. Charlie laughed, though the situation was far from funny. "All right, boys, enough experiments. Let me try my approach." Charlie Weasley had always been fascinated by magical creatures. He studied everything he could about them back at Hogwarts, and now was preparing to work with dragons in Romania. He knew that every magical creature had its weaknesses, fears, and preferences, and garden gnomes, despite their primitiveness, were also magical creatures. Gnomes, Charlie explained as he and Percy washed the twins of Sticky Stickum, are social beings. They have a hierarchy, territorial instincts. If you find their leader and drive him away, the others will follow. "And how do we find the leader?" Percy asked, pulling the last foam from Fred's hair. "By size and behavior," Charlie answered. "Usually it's the biggest and most aggressive gnome, the one who commands the others." They returned to the garden and began observing. And indeed, among the gnome commotion, one stood out. That same big gnome with brownish-green skin and a tuft of dried grass on his head. He didn't fuss about like the others, but sat calmly on a pile of earth, occasionally saying something in gnome language. Other gnomes clearly reacted to his commands. One ran to bring a carrot, another began digging a new burrow, a third chased a younger gnome from the best spot by the currant bushes. "That's him," Charlie whispered, "the leader." "And what are you going to do?" Percy whispered back. "Challenge to a duel," Charlie said seriously. "What?" "Well, not literally a duel, but something similar. I need to show I'm stronger, demonstrate dominance." Charlie stepped into an open space in the garden and loudly clapped his hands. All the gnomes froze, looking at him. The big gnome slowly rose and turned to Charlie, tilting his head to one side. "All right," Charlie said, looking the gnome straight in his small black eyes. "I don't want to hurt you, but this is our garden, our territory. You have no place here." The gnome continued to stare. Then, quite unexpectedly, he spoke. Not Gerafme or anything like that, but pronounced something that sounded almost like real words. "Ours was Fiirst." Everyone was stunned into silence. Percy even dropped his notebook. You can talk?" Charlie asked, impressed. The gnome nodded his potato-like head. "Old, remember, field, not house. He's saying they were here first." Percy translated, though everyone had already understood. "Before we built the burrow." "This is our field," Charlie insisted, though a bit less confidently. "Your field." "Our garden." The gnome answered and smiled, showing yellow teeth. "Not go." "Well then," Charlie sighed. "I tried to negotiate, now plan B." Plan B turned out to be quite simple. Try to get ahead of the gnomes organizationally. If they had become smarter and more coordinated, they needed to act the same way. Charlie proposed working as a team. One distracts, the others grab and throw gnomes one by one, methodically combing through the garden. They carefully executed the plan. Fred and George distracted the gnomes from one side of the garden, waving bright rags. Charlie and Percy from the other side quickly grabbed gnomes and threw them over the hedge. For some time it even worked. They threw out at least 10 gnomes. But then the gnomes adapted. They began using guerrilla warfare tactics, hiding in bushes, appearing from unexpected places. One even jumped out of the watering bucket and bit Fred on the leg. Others began digging new tunnels that connected underground, creating a real labyrinth. Now a gnome could disappear into one burrow and emerge in a completely different place. By lunchtime, the boys were exhausted, scratched, and discouraged. They sat on the porch, sipping lemonade that Molly had brought. "Maybe we should just give up," George suggested gloomily. "Let them live in the garden." "Mum will kill us," Percy reminded him darkly. "Maybe not as painfully as these blasted gnomes," Fred muttered, examining a fresh bruise on his arm. Just then the fireplace in the living room roared with green fire, and from it emerged a tall, red-haired young man in a traveling cloak. Bill Weasley, the eldest of the brothers, worked as a curse breaker at Gringotts Bank and rarely came home. But today he had a day off and decided to visit the family. "Hello, boys," he called out cheerfully, shaking ash from his cloak. "What's with the funeral faces?" "Gnomes," the four brothers answered in chorus. Bill went out to the garden and whistled. Wow, there are more of them than there were last time. And they're getting smarter, Charlie added. They even have a leader who speaks. Speaks? Bill was surprised. That's interesting. He walked around the garden for a long time, examining the burrows, watching the gnomes who warily monitored him from their hiding places. Bill had experience working with curses and magical traps, and his approach was more technical than his brothers. All right, he finally said, I have an idea. We'll create a magical barrier, not to drive them away, but so they can't return after being thrown out. Is that possible? Percy asked, immediately intrigued. At Gringotts we use similar barriers to protect against goblins. I mean to protect vaults, Bill corrected himself. The same principle can be applied here. We just need markers around the perimeter and the right spell. They set to work enthusiastically. Bill placed small silver runes around the garden perimeter that he'd brought with him. These were simple protective symbols used to ward off pests. Then he began weaving a complex spell, connecting the runes with invisible magical threads. This should create a barrier, he explained, moving his wand through the air. Gnomes will be able to leave, but they won't be able to return. Like one-way doors, Percy guessed. Exactly. Bill finished the spell, and for a moment pale blue light flashed around the garden perimeter, then immediately went out. The runes hissed and covered with frost. Done, Bill said with satisfaction. Now we just throw them out and they won't be able to return. They set about throwing out gnomes again. And at first it seemed Bill's method was working. The first several gnomes thrown over the barrier really couldn't return. They beat against an invisible wall, screeched in despair, but couldn't pass through it. But the big gnome, their leader, was no fool. He watched, analyzed, thought, and then did something ingenious. He began to dig. Not just dig a new burrow, but dig a tunnel under the barrier. Bill's magical protection worked above ground, but not below it. And in an hour, the tunnel had an exit just beyond the barrier's boundary. The gnomes began mass exodus through the new tunnel, bypassing the protection. They even organized something like a victory parade. One after another, in a line, like a small army returning to its territory. No, Bill groaned watching this spectacle. This is impossible. They shouldn't be this smart. Welcome to our life, Percy said gloomily. They're outplaying us, Charlie admitted. For every action we take, they have a response. Fred and George were silent, but on their faces was something like, respect? Yes, respect for the gnomes who had proven to be worthy opponents. In the evening, when the sun was tilting toward the horizon and the sky was ablaze with red and gold, the 5 Weasley brothers sat on the porch, disappointed and exhausted. The garden behind them teemed with gnomes. There were even more of them than yesterday. It seemed they had begun multiplying or, worse, had called reinforcements from the surrounding fields. The big gnome sat on his throne of earth pile and chewed something. He looked at the boys and seemed to be smiling. Or it was just the reflection of the sun on his potato-like face. Mum will kill us, Percy repeated his favorite phrase. Most likely, Bill agreed. Maybe we should run away to Romania, George suggested. Dragons can't be scarier than an angry Mrs. Weasley. They can be, Charlie objected, but Mum is scarier. They all laughed, though unhappily. The door behind them opened, and Molly appeared. She surveyed the garden, then looked at her sons. Her face was unreadable, but in her eyes flashed something dangerous. I see your attempts again weren't crowned with success, she said quietly. Mum, we really tried, Percy began. We used Lockhart's methods, our inventions, knowledge about magical creatures, even Bill's professional curse-breaker techniques. But the gnomes are smarter, Molly finished. I see. She was silent, looking at the garden. The gnomes were already beginning their evening activity. Some were dancing, others digging, still others just sitting and eating the remains of the vegetables. All right, Molly finally said. You have one more day. Tomorrow. Last chance. If tomorrow evening the gnomes are still here. She paused, and in that pause were so many promises and threats. that all 5 brothers involuntarily shuddered. "Then, I'll take matters into my own hands." She turned and went back into the house, leaving behind tense silence. "Boys," Fred whispered, "for the first time in my life I'm afraid of tomorrow." "Not just you," George answered. In the garden the big gnome had heard this conversation. He didn't understand all the words, but the tone was clear. Something was supposed to happen tomorrow. Something important. Something, perhaps, dangerous. He looked around at his gnome army. Over the past 2 days they had become a real community. They had learned to work together, to help each other, to think strategically. They had won battle after battle against these young wizards. But now something had changed. That woman, the mother, she hadn't fought yet. She had only watched. And judged. And now she was going to act. The big gnome felt uneasy. In his long gnome life, he had seen many wizards. Young, old, experienced, inexperienced. But mothers were different. Mothers protecting their homes were the most dangerous force in the world. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. But he knew one thing for certain. The real battle was only beginning. And in the burrow, in her bedroom, Molly Weasley stood by the window, looking at the garden. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet determination. Tomorrow she would show these gnomes what real magic was. Tomorrow they would learn why one should never, ever threaten a mother's home. Because maternal love is the strongest magic in the world. And maternal fury is a force against which there is no defense. The 3rd day began with a scream. Molly Weasley woke early as always, and went out to the yard to take down yesterday's laundry she had hung out to dry in the evening. But the line was empty. Completely empty. Not a single shirt, not a single pair of socks, even the clothespins were gone. At first she thought it was the wind. But there had been no wind last night. Then she noticed tracks, small prints of horny feet leading from the line straight to the garden. "No," she whispered, feeling anger boiling in her chest. "They didn't dare." She followed the tracks and found her laundry. Arthur's favorite shirt hung on the elderberry bush, but covered in mud stains. Charlie's denim shirt was torn to shreds and used as a nest. In it slept an entire brood of little gnomelets, and her own favorite nightgown, which she had received last Christmas, now proudly flew on a pole stuck in the ground like a flag. On it the gnomes had apparently drawn something like their coat of arms, a potato-like head with a crown. Molly stood in the middle of the garden, trembling with indignation. Her face reddened, her hands clenched into fists, and in her eyes flashed such a flame that it seemed she could burn down the entire garden with just her gaze. "Boys!" Her voice was so loud that in the shed where the cat was sleeping, tools fell from Arthur's shelves. "Everyone here, now!" The 5 brothers appeared instantly, in varying states of wakefulness. Charlie was half-dressed, Percy had forgotten his glasses, Fred and George had jumped out in their pajamas, and Bill, who had stayed the night, looked as if he'd just been awakened after too short a sleep. "Look," Molly pointed with a trembling hand at the destruction. "Look what these, she couldn't even find a strong enough word. "What these blasted gnomes have done." The boys stared at the picture of chaos. Laundry scattered all over the garden. Clothespins stuck in the ground like little tombstones. And on that pole with the nightgown, sat the big gnome eating an apple, looking at them with an expression of contemptuous superiority on his potato-like face. This is war now," Bill said quietly. "This was war from the very beginning," Molly answered, but her voice already sounded calmer, which was even more frightening than shouting. "And I'm giving you one last chance. Today, by sunset, I want to see this garden clean of gnomes, all of them, to the very last one. Otherwise—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The threat hung in the air like a thundercloud. "But if today doesn't work out either," she continued, and in her voice sounded an ominous promise, "then I'll take care of it myself, and you'd better not get in my way." She turned and went back to the house, her step decisive and heavy. The door closed with a loud slam. The 5 brothers stood in the garden, looking at each other. Ron and Ginny were peeking out the upper floor window, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "Boys," Charlie sighed, running his hand through his hair, "I think we'd better take this seriously." This isn't a joke anymore, Percy agreed, adjusting the glasses he'd managed to grab before coming out. I've never seen Mum so furious. Come on, Fred tried to joke. Remember when George and I launched fireworks in the living room? Then she just yelled. George answered. And now, she was. Calm. Calm, Mum is scary, Mum. So what are we going to do? Bill asked, surveying the garden. We only have one day. We'll use everything, Charlie said decisively. All the methods at once. Percy's spells, the twins' inventions, my knowledge of magical creatures, your runes, Bill. Everything together, coordinated, like a military operation. A military operation against gnomes, Percy muttered, but was already getting out his notebook. All right, I need 20 minutes to compose a detailed plan. They returned to the house, quickly ate breakfast under Molly's tense gaze, and gathered in Percy's room. There, on his tidy desk, they laid out a map of the garden that Percy had drawn the previous evening and began planning. So, Percy pointed at the map. The gnomes are concentrated mainly here, here, and here. Their leader usually sits on this pile of earth. They have 3 main tunnels that we know of, and possibly several more hidden ones. I can place runes here and here, Bill pointed on the map. This will create a double barrier. If they try to dig under it, the second layer will stop them. And George and I can use an improved version of Sticky Stickum, Fred suggested. Last time it exploded because we added too much purple antimony, but if we reduce the dose and add stabilizer from sneezewood grass. George finished. It won't explode but will become even stickier. I can try using dragon lizard pheromones, Charlie added. They repel small rodents and might work on gnomes. And I'll guide Charlie through all of Lockhate's spells again, Percy said. Perhaps if we use them all together they'll finally work. That sounds like a plan, Bill nodded. When do we start? Now, Charlie answered decisively. The next hours turned into a whirlwind of activity. Bill placed his silver runes all around the garden perimeter, creating a complex magical network. He muttered ancient Egyptian incantations under his breath that he'd learned while working at Gringotts. The runes glowed with pale blue light, forming invisible lines of protection. Fred and George prepared their improved Sticky Stickum in the shed. They carefully mixed ingredients, periodically checking the consistency. This time the substance looked more stable. It had a pleasant green color and smelled of mint, not rotten cabbage. Think it'll work? George asked, stirring the mixture with a wooden spoon. It has to work, Fred answered with more confidence than he actually felt. We fixed all the mistakes. Charlie, meanwhile, was placing small glass vials of dragon lizard pheromones around the garden. The liquid inside was bright red and emitted a light smoke. The smell was sharp and slightly sulphurous, not the most pleasant, but Charlie hoped that was exactly what would repel the gnomes. Percy coordinated all actions from his command post, an old crate turned upside down by the door. He held his notebook and pencil, recording each step of the operation. Bill, rune number 7 shifted slightly to the left, he shouted. Fred, George, you need more stickum near the north entrance. Charlie, don't forget the pheromones by the currant bushes. By noon, everything was ready. The garden looked like a battlefield before a great clash. Runes glowed around the perimeter. Green Sticky Stickum was smeared near every burrow. Pheromones evaporated in the air, creating a chimeric fog. So, Charlie wiped sweat from his forehead. Shall we begin? We begin, Percy nodded, checking his list. First, Charlie uses Lockhart's spells. Then we activate Bill's runes. Then the pheromones. And if the gnomes still don't leave, we start throwing them out manually, and the stickum will hold them. Charlie stood in the center of the garden, drew his wand, and took a deep breath. He began pronouncing Lockhart's spells one after another, adding maximum confidence, and, as Lockhart wrote, innate charisma to each one. Gnomus dispario maximus, repello gnomus, evanescere creaturas. From his wand flew multicolored sparks, blue, green, red. They circled above the garden, forming a complex pattern. For a moment it seemed this had worked. Several gnomes shuddered and screeched anxiously, but the big gnome, their leader, didn't even flinch. He looked at Charlie with an expression that could be called a mixture of boredom and slight contempt. Activate the runes, Percy commanded. Bill waved his wand, and the runes flared with bright light. A magical barrier rose as a visible wall of blue flame surrounding the garden. It hummed with a low, menacing sound. The gnomes froze, looking at the wall of fire. Several younger gnomelets hid in burrows. But the big gnome rose, approached the barrier and extended his hand. His hand passed through the flame without any harm. "What?" Bill exclaimed. "This is impossible. These runes are supposed to protect against all magical creatures." The big gnome smiled, showing yellow teeth, and pronounced, "Older magic, stronger." "He's right," Charlie said quietly. "Gnomes existed here long before we began using this magic. They're possibly immune to it." "Then the pheromones," Percy commanded, feeling panic rising in his chest. Charlie activated the vials with pheromones. They exploded with red smoke that quickly filled the garden. The smell became unbearable, sharp, sulphurous, cutting the eyes. The boys themselves began coughing and retreating, but the gnomes simply closed their eyes, took a deep breath, and began joyfully screeching. One of them even started dancing. "Giraffe me yummy!" he shouted, breathing in the red smoke. They like it?" Fred asked in surprise, wiping tears from his eyes. "Seems so," Charlie answered grimly. "All right," Percy reviewed his list, his hands trembling. "Plan D. We throw them out manually, and the stickum will hold them." They rushed into the garden. Charlie grabbed the first gnome and threw him onto the green stickum near a burrow. The gnome stuck as planned and began screeching. "Success!" But then the other gnomes began acting. They didn't panic. They didn't fuss. They organized. The big gnome shouted something in gnome language, and suddenly all the gnomes began acting in a coordinated manner. A group of gnomes rushed to the shed. Another to the house. A third began quickly digging new tunnels. "What are they doing?" George shouted. The answer came quickly and terribly. The gnomes who ran to the shed dragged out garden tools, rakes, spades, even the old bucket. Those who ran to the house returned with Charlie's wand. "How?" Charlie grabbed at his pocket, where he usually kept his wand. "I left it there. When did they manage?" The big gnome held the wand in his small hands, examining it with interest. He waved it, and from the tip flew pathetic green sparks. The gnome laughed, a deep hoarse laugh that sounded unusual for such a small creature. "Give it back!" Charlie rushed forward, but several gnomes blocked his way, waving rakes. Meanwhile, another group of gnomes dragged out brooms, 4 brooms that the twins and older brothers flew on in summer. They laid them on the ground, and one particularly large gnome began gnawing them. His sharp teeth chewed through the wood with cracking and crunching. "No!" Fred and George wailed simultaneously. "Not our brooms!" But the worst was ahead. The gnomes who had been digging tunnels suddenly emerged from underground right in the center of the garden, where Molly tended her most beloved beds of tomatoes and carrots. They began bursting out of the ground by the dozens, like some terrible army of undead, and each gnome dragged vegetables behind him. Tomatoes flew in all directions. Carrots the gnomes ate right on the spot, demonstrating their victory. Cabbages they rolled out like bulls. This was no longer just a counterattack. This was declared war. "This is a catastrophe," Percy whispered, watching the chaos around. "An absolute catastrophe." Charlie was still trying to get his wand back, but the gnomes were playing a kind of game with him, passing the wand to each other, and every time Charlie approached, the wand ended up with another gnome. Bill was trying to restore his runes, but the gnomes began digging them up and throwing them in a bucket of water, where they hissed and went out. Fred and George sat on the ground by their mangled brooms, looking as if they wanted to cry. 7 years, Fred said quietly. "I flew on this broom for 7 years. "And I, 5, George added. "And now it's, they couldn't even finish the sentence. It was at this moment, when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, that the house door opened. Molly Weasley came out onto the threshold. She held a laundry basket in her hands, and was probably going to hang out the washed laundry again. But then she saw the garden. She saw the scattered vegetables, the mangled brooms, her sons sitting among the ruins of their plan. the gnomes dancing a victory dance on a pile of her beloved vegetables. The basket fell from her hands. Laundry scattered on the floor. And on Molly's face appeared an expression that none of her sons had ever seen before. This wasn't anger. This wasn't fury. This was something much deeper, much more terrible. This was cold, calm, absolute determination. Everyone. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but somehow everyone heard it clearly. Into the house. Now. But Mum, Charlie began. Now. They didn't dare object. The 5 brothers quickly rose and ran to the house. Even Ron and Ginny, who had been watching from the window, retreated deeper into the room. Molly stood on the threshold, looking at the garden. The gnomes, sensing something wrong, began to calm down. Their dances slowed. The screeching subsided. Even the big gnome, their leader, who was still holding Charlie's wand, froze, looking at this small, red-haired woman. "You wanted war?" Molly asked quietly, and in her voice sounded a threat that made even the air seem colder. "Good." She took a step into the garden. Then, another. Her own wand appeared in her hand, and from it emanated such power that even experienced Bill felt shivers run down his spine. "Boys," he whispered, watching from the window, "I think we'd better get as far from the windows as possible." "Why?" Percy asked. "Because," Bill swallowed, "now we're going to see why you shouldn't anger Mrs. Molly Weasley." In the garden, Molly stopped in the middle of the destruction. She slowly looked around at the gnomes, the mangled brooms, the scattered vegetables. Her face was calm, but in her eyes burned a cold, determined fire. The big gnome looked at Charlie's wand in his hands, then at Molly, then at the wand again. He felt that his trophy had suddenly turned into a pathetic toy compared to the power that now stood before them. The gnomes began nervously glancing at each other. Some retreated to their burrows, others froze in place, not daring to move. But Molly didn't raise her wand. She stood, looking at the gnomes, and in this silence was something more terrible than any spell. The tension in the air grew with every second. "Tomorrow," she finally said, and her voice was quiet but hard as steel. "Tomorrow at dawn I'll show you what real Weasley magic is." She paused, allowing these words to reach every gnome, every son standing behind the windows. "And now enjoy your victory," she continued with a cold smile. "Because this is the last night you'll spend in my garden." Molly turned and went to the house. Her step was calm, confident. She didn't look back. She didn't need to look back. She knew everyone was watching her back with a mixture of fear and awe. When the door closed behind her, dead silence fell over the garden. The gnomes weren't celebrating. They weren't dancing. They just stood, understanding they had just received a warning. The final warning. The big gnome slowly lowered Charlie's wand to the ground. His small black eyes looked at the dark windows of the burrow, and for the first time in all these days fear appeared in them, real fear. Inside the house, the 5 Weasley brothers stood by the living room window, looking at the garden. "What happens now?" Percy whispered. "Tomorrow at dawn," Charlie answered just as quietly. "We'll find out what it truly means to be the son of Molly Weasley." Arthur Weasley approached them, placing his hands on Charlie and Bill's shoulders. "Boys," he said seriously, "what you'll see tomorrow, remember it. Remember and pass it on to your children. Because it's not often one gets to see true power." "Dad," George asked timidly, "did you know Mum could do such things?" Arthur smiled, but in his smile was something sad and at the same time proud. "I've been married to your mother for almost 20 years, he said, "and I knew she was strong. But even I didn't know how much. Molly never boasts of her strength. She guards it, saves it for those moments when it's truly needed." "And now is such a moment," Bill guessed. "Yes," Arthur nodded. "Now is such a moment." They all stood by the window for a long time, looking at the garden where the gnomes were slowly dispersing to their burrows. The festive atmosphere had vanished. Instead, tense anticipation hung in the air. "Go to bed," Arthur finally said. Tomorrow will be a long day, but no one could sleep. Fred and George lay in their beds, staring at the ceiling. Percy reread his notes but couldn't concentrate. Charlie stood by the window, watching the garden. Bill sat on his bed, thinking about all the curses and spells he knew, and trying to imagine what his mother could do. And Molly slept peacefully in her bedroom. Her face was serene, her breathing even. She knew what she had to do, she always knew. And tomorrow she would show it. The night slowly passed over the Burrow. Stars shone from the sky, the moon rose higher and higher. And in the east, the sky was already beginning to lighten, promising a new day. A day when the gnomes would learn what real Molly Weasley magic was. The first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and peach. In the Burrow, everyone woke almost simultaneously. Who could sleep after what Molly had promised? The 5 Weasley brothers were already standing by the windows when their mother emerged from the bedroom. She was dressed simply, an old house dress, an apron, comfortable shoes. Her red hair gathered in a tight bun at the nape of her neck. In her hand, a wand, simple, without ornament, but one that had served her faithfully for over 20 years. Molly didn't say a word. She simply walked past her sons, descended the stairs, and headed to the pantry. The boys exchanged glances and on tiptoe, making no sound, followed her, stopping at the pantry door. They watched as she quietly selected jars of ingredients, dried herbs, powders, tinctures. Her fingers glided across the shelves confidently, without hesitation. Nettle, gathered under a full moon. Powdered mandrake root, essence of wormwood. 3 drops of dew from rose petals. And finally, a small dark vial she retrieved from the farthest corner of the shelf. "This is my grandmother's potion," Molly said quietly, not turning around but knowing her sons stood behind her. "She taught me to brew it when I was 17. Said it would come in handy when I had my own home, my own family." She turned, holding all the ingredients. "Watch," she said, "but don't interfere." The boys nodded, not daring even to breathe loudly. Molly went to the kitchen and placed a small copper cauldron on the stove. She began adding ingredients one by one, in the proper order, murmuring ancient words under her breath. So quietly that even standing nearby, the boys couldn't make them out completely. But they felt the power of those words. The air in the kitchen became thicker, heavier. The potion began to bubble, releasing silver smoke that smelled of summer herbs and thunderstorms simultaneously. "This isn't just a potion," Molly explained quietly, continuing to stir. "This is memory. Memory of the land, memory of the family, memory of why one must protect one's home." When the potion was ready, it glowed from within with a soft silver light. Molly carefully poured it into a small glass vial and attached it to her belt. Then she took several more items from the pantry, an old copper bell, a bundle of dried sage, a small mirror in a silver frame. Arthur appeared in the kitchen, sleepy, but with firm determination in his eyes. "Molly," he began. "Everything will be fine, Arthur." She smiled, kissing his cheek. "I know what I'm doing." "I don't doubt it," he answered. "I just want you to know, I'm proud of you, always have been." Molly squeezed his hand, then turned to her sons. "Stay here," she ordered. "Watch if you want, but don't come out. Whatever happens, don't leave the house until I call you." "Yes, Mum," they answered in chorus. Molly stepped onto the porch. The morning sun illuminated her figure. And in that moment, she looked not like an ordinary housewife, but like something much more. Like a sorceress from ancient legends. Like a warrior going into a final battle. In the garden, the gnomes were no longer sleeping. They were waiting. The big gnome stood on his pile of earth, and around him gathered all the others, perhaps 50 gnomes, ready for what was about to happen. Molly calmly stepped onto the garden soil. She didn't hurry. She looked around, assessing the situation, planning her actions. The gnomes froze, watching her with wary curiosity. She stopped in the middle of the garden and looked at the big gnome. Their gazes met. The small black eyes of the gnome, and the warm brown eyes of the woman, which now burned like hot coals. "You're stubborn," she said quietly, but her voice carried across the entire garden. "I respect that, but this garden is mine. This land is mine. This is my home, where I raise my children, where I care for my family, and I won't let you take it." The big gnome tilted his head, listening. He didn't understand all the words, but the tone was clear. This was a challenge. The final challenge. "Older," he croaked, holding Charlie's wand like a weapon. "We older. We're here first." "Perhaps," Molly nodded, "but now my family is here, and I will protect it at any cost." She raised her wand, and what happened next would remain forever in the memory of all who witnessed it. Molly didn't begin with an attack. She began with protection. Her wand traced a complex pattern in the air, and around the garden appeared a shimmering circle of silver light. This wasn't a simple barrier like the one Bill had created. This was an ancient protective charm that required not only strength, but absolute confidence, unbreakable will. "Protego hortum sacrum," she pronounced clearly, and her voice sounded as if not one woman spoke but a chorus of voices. "Domus mea, fortitudo mea." At the window, Bill held his breath. That's a 5th level Latin protective charm," he whispered. "It's only taught in masterclasses. How does she—" The silver circle shone brighter, then began to rise upward, forming a dome over the garden. But unlike Bill's barrier, this protection didn't aim to keep the gnomes inside. It protected what remained of the vegetables, the house, the family. It created a sacred space, an inviolable boundary. The gnomes froze, feeling the power of this spell. Even the big gnome stepped back, his confidence beginning to crack. Then Molly took out the vial with the potion. She opened it, and silver smoke slowly began pouring out, spreading along the ground like fog. The smoke didn't rise upward, it stretched along the ground, finding every gnome burrow, penetrating inside, filling the tunnels. "This isn't poison," Molly explained, though the gnomes hardly understood. "This is memory, memory of why you should fear. Memory that human magic can be merciful, but can also be terrible." The smoke reached the gnomes, and they began to screech. But this wasn't ordinary screeching of fear. It was something deeper. The potion awakened in them ancient instincts, old memories embedded in their genes about times when wizards weren't gentle homemakers, but powerful mages, who had to be feared. "Is she really using memory magic?" Percy whispered in amazement. That's considered a lost art." But Molly wasn't finished yet. She took the bundle of sage and lit it with the tip of her wand. The grass burst into flame not with orange fire but green, and the smoke from it was thick and fragrant. She walked around the garden perimeter, waving the smoking bundle, pronouncing words of an ancient cleansing ritual. "Depello maleficum, renovar terra, sanitas domus." With each step, with each word, the ground beneath her feet began to glow. It was a barely noticeable radiance, but it came from within, as if the earth itself was responding to Molly's call. The beds that had been destroyed began to look cleaner. The weeds that had grown in recent days began to wilt and crumble. The gnomes fussed, trying to hide deeper in their burrows, but the silver smoke found them everywhere. They couldn't escape from it, just as one can't escape one's own shadow. Then Molly took the mirror. She raised it to the sky, catching a ray of morning sun. The light reflected from the mirror and transformed into a thin, bright beam that she directed at the ground. The beam touched the earth near the largest gnome burrow, and smoke began coming from there. Not magical, but ordinary, grey smoke. "Evanesco latibulum," Molly said calmly, and the beam became brighter. The burrow began to collapse. It didn't explode, didn't cave in, it simply began to disappear, as if it had never existed. The ground leveled out, grass began to grow where the entrance had been. In a matter of minutes, not a trace of the burrow remained. "That's 5th order transfiguration," Charlie barely breathed out. "I didn't even know that was possible with Earth." Molly moved the beam to the next burrow, then to the next. She worked methodically, calmly, without haste. Each burrow disappeared, leaving nothing behind. The gnomes fell into panic. They fussed, ran, screeched. Some tried to dig new tunnels, but the earth wouldn't obey them. It had become hard as stone, protected by Molly's magic. Others tried to break through the silver barrier, but it wouldn't let them through. The big gnome stood in the middle of the garden, clutching Charlie's wand. He understood he had lost. Lost not because he was weaker, but because he had encountered a force he couldn't comprehend. The force of a mother protecting her home. He looked at Molly one last time, then slowly, with dignity, laid the wand on the ground. It was a gesture of capitulation. But Molly wasn't finished yet. She didn't just want to drive away the gnomes. She wanted them to remember this lesson forever. So they would tell other gnomes. So no one else would dare to return. She raised her wand high above her head and pronounced a spell that made everyone in the house hold their breath. Tempestas expellare. Something began descending from the sky. At first it looked like a cloud, dark and menacing. Then the cloud began to rotate, forming a vortex. And in the center of the vortex appeared something that resembled an enormous face, a face made of wind, rain and lightning. "My God," Bill whispered, grabbing the windowsill. "She's creating a weather elemental. That's almost impossible." This wasn't a real storm. It was an illusion, but so convincing, so impressive, that even those who knew about magic felt fear. And for the gnomes with their primitive minds, it looked like the wrath of the gods themselves. The face from the storm looked down at the garden. Its eyes were lightning, its mouth, the roar of wind. It leaned closer to the gnomes, and from its breath tree branches bent, and small whirlwinds appeared on the ground. Then it pronounced one word, and this word sounded like thunder, making the earth shudder. "Begone!" The gnomes howled in terror. Their eyes widened impossibly wide. Small bodies trembled. This was too much. The silver smoke, the disappearing burrows, and now this terrible face from the sky commanding them to flee. They rushed to the edge of the garden, not choosing their path, stumbling over each other. The big gnome, their leader who had held his ground all this time, also ran. He grabbed his closest companions and pulled them to the exit. Other gnomes ran after him, creating a real stampede. Molly lowered the barrier on one side, the one that led to the fields, away from the house. The gnomes threw themselves into this gap like water through a hole in a dam. They ran, falling, getting up and running again. Some even forgot to grab their belongings, so great was their fear. In a matter of minutes, not a single gnome remained in the garden. Even the little gnomelets, who would usually have hidden deep underground, were fleeing along with all the others, their squeaky voices adding to the general chaos. Molly watched as the last gnome, the big one, their leader, stopped at the edge of the field and turned around. He looked at her one last time, and in his gaze was something like understanding, respect, fear. It was hard to say. Their gazes met for a moment, an old sorceress and an old gnome, both protectors of their own, both warriors in their own right. Then he turned and ran after his tribe, and soon all the gnomes had disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind only a cloud of dust. Molly lowered her wand. The face from the storm dissipated, leaving behind only the clear morning sky. The silver barrier faded with a final shimmer. The potion stopped smoking. The green smoke from the sage dispersed on the wind. In the garden remained only her, a small red-haired woman in an old dress and apron, who had just demonstrated magic of such power that even experienced wizards could envy. She stood for a moment, looking at the horizon where the gnomes had vanished. Then she took a deep breath of morning air, smiled, and bent down to pick up Charlie's wand from the ground. She wiped it on her apron, checked it wasn't damaged, and returned to the house. When she entered the kitchen, the whole family was waiting for her there. Arthur, the 5 older sons, Ron and Ginny, they all stood, looking at her with expressions that wavered between horror, admiration, and absolute astonishment. The silence lasted several seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. "Mum, that was..." Charlie began. "Incredible," Bill exclaimed. "Where did you learn such things?" Percy asked. "You are like a goddess of vengeance." Fred breathed out enthusiastically. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life," George added. Molly laughed. Quietly, sincerely with relief. Calm down, she said, raising her hands. "It was just magic. Old magic that my grandmother taught me." She held out Charlie's wand. "I believe this is yours." Charlie took the wand with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mum. And, sorry we couldn't manage." "You tried," Molly patted his cheek. "And that's what matters most. but sometimes there are things only a mother can handle. Because a mother protects her home like no one else can. Bill approached closer, his eyes still wide open. "Mum, what you did?" He swallowed. "I've worked with curses for 5 years. I've seen the best curse breakers at Gringotts, and I've never seen anything like that. Latin protective charms, memory magic, 5th order transfiguration, creating an elemental. Where did you learn all this?" Molly smiled, walked to the stove, and began preparing breakfast, as if she hadn't just driven away an army of gnomes with ancient magic. "From my grandmother," she answered simply, cracking eggs into the pan. "She was a very wise woman, came from an ancient line of sorceresses. She told me that a sorceress's true power isn't in attacking, but in protecting. Protecting one's home, one's family, what is dear to you." "But why did you never tell us about this?" Percy asked, getting out his notebook to write down everything he remembered. Molly turned the eggs and turned to the children. "Because this isn't the kind of magic to boast about," she explained seriously. "This is magic to be guarded, to be used only when it's truly needed. Grandmother told me, Molly, there's a time to demonstrate power, and a time to conceal it. A wise wizard knows the difference." She paused, looking at each of her children. "The magic you saw today requires not just skill, it requires maturity, absolute control, unbreakable will. And most importantly, it requires deep understanding of what you're protecting and why." Little Ginny approached her mother and hugged her around the waist. "Mum, will you teach me such charms when I grow up?" Molly pressed her daughter to herself. "Of course, my little one, when the time comes, when you're ready. This magic has been passed from mother to daughter in our family for many generations." Arthur approached his wife and embraced her. "Molly Weasley," he said quietly, but so everyone could hear. "You're the most amazing woman I've ever known. I've been married to you for almost 20 years, and you still know how to amaze me." "That's good," Molly smiled, not releasing the spatula for the eggs. "Means you haven't gotten completely used to me yet." "I'll never get used to you," Arthur assured her, his eyes shining with pride. "Especially after what I saw today. And now," Molly turned to the family with a smile, "who will help set the table? I'm a bit tired and want to treat my family to a delicious breakfast." The next hours passed in pleasant bustle. Bill and Charlie went out to examine the garden and discovered with surprise that it looked better than before the gnomes appeared. The earth was soft and nutritious, the beds even and clean, even some plants that had seemed destroyed began to grow back. "She didn't just drive away the gnomes," Bill said in amazement, squatting and touching the earth. "She restored the garden, blessed it. This is ancient magic of fertility and rebirth." "Our mum is full of surprises," Charlie smiled, looking at the place where yesterday had been the largest gnome burrow and now grew fresh green grass. At breakfast, the atmosphere was unusual. Usually food at the Weasleys was accompanied by noise, jokes, quarrels. But now everyone was strangely quiet, occasionally casting glances at Molly, who calmly ate her eggs and spread butter on toast. "Mum," Fred began timidly, setting down his fork, "could you, if it's not a secret, teach us some of those spells?" Molly smiled but shook her head. "When you grow up," she answered, "and when you have your own families, your own homes that will need protecting. Some things require not just skill but maturity. And you've known how to do this for a long time," Ginny asked in a small voice. Molly looked at her only daughter and gently stroked her red head. "Since the day your oldest brother Bill was born," she said warmly. "That day I realized I now had something most precious in the world that I would protect at any cost. And magic came by itself, because it feeds on love." "Love?" Percy repeated in surprise. "But what we saw was rather aggressive." "Protection can look aggressive," Molly explained, "but love is always at its foundation. I didn't want to destroy the gnomes, Percy. I wanted to show them this home is protected. That a family lives here that I guard. And they understood. The big gnome, he understood. That's why he laid down the wand and left. He chose retreat over a battle he couldn't win." She looked around at all her children, then at Arthur. "You all must remember one thing," she said seriously. "Magic isn't just spells and charms. Magic is what's in your heart. Why you use it, what you protect, what you believe in. Without that, even the most powerful spell is just empty words." Ron, who had been silent until now, suddenly exclaimed, "Mum, you're the best. When I grow up, I want to be as strong as you." "Me too," Ginny added. "All of us," Charlie said, and his brothers nodded. Molly laughed, and in that laughter was all her love, all her warmth, all her strength. "Then study well, obey your teachers at Hogwarts, and don't forget that true strength is in family," she said. "And now finish breakfast. We still have lots of work, need to plant a new garden, repair the twins, brooms." "The brooms!" Fred and George exclaimed simultaneously, remembering their mangled brooms. "Don't worry," Molly reassured them. "Arthur already looked at them. They're damaged, but not hopeless. Your father will repair them by the end of the week, Mum." George raised his hand. "Will the gnomes definitely not come back?" Molly thought for a moment, then smiled confidently. "No, at least not anytime soon. Perhaps in many years, when the big gnome and his generation die, other gnomes will forget this lesson and try to return. But for now, they remember. And they'll tell the story of this day to their children and grandchildren. And if they do come back someday," Bill added with a smile, "well, now we know who to turn to for help." "Exactly," Molly agreed. After breakfast, life at the Burrow began returning to its usual rhythm. Arthur went to the shed to work on the brooms. Bill helped him, discussing the subtleties of repair. Charlie and Percy went to the garden to start planning what to plant. Fred and George, after making sure the brooms could still be saved, returned to their experiments in the attic. Ron and Ginny played in the yard. And Molly stood by the sink washing dishes and looking out the window at her family. At her children who were running, laughing, working. At her husband who was patiently explaining something to Bill about wood enchantment. At her garden that was again clean and peaceful. She smiled. Yes, this morning had been difficult. Yes, she'd had to use magic she had almost forgotten. But the result was worth it. The next day, when Percy went out to the garden to check the beds, he noticed two small gnomes at the very edge of the field. They stood at a distance, warily looking at the burrow. Percy didn't run to catch them. He just quietly called, "Mum!" Molly came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the gnomes. The gnomes saw her, froze for a moment, and their small potato-like heads simultaneously turned. They rushed to flee so fast, their little feet barely touched the ground, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Molly laughed. "See, Percy," she said. "They remember." "Of course they remember," Percy said with pride in his voice. Who could forget Mrs. Molly Weasley? That evening the whole family gathered again at the dinner table. Molly had prepared a festive meal: meat pie for Charlie, mashed potatoes for Percy, sweet pudding for the twins, roast chicken for Bill, and her signature raisin buns for everyone. "Mum," Fred said, carefully chewing the pie, "this is the best meal of my life." "And not just because the food is delicious," George added, "but because we're eating it in a garden without gnomes." Everyone laughed, raising their cups. "To a garden without gnomes," Ron exclaimed. But Arthur stood, holding his cup of tea, and his face became serious. "No," he said, "not just for that. I want to make a toast to Molly Weasley." He looked at his wife, and tears of pride glistened in his eyes. "To the woman who reminded us all that the strongest magic in the world is a mother's love for her family. To the woman who protects her home with such courage and strength that even ancient creatures flee in terror. To the woman we all love, and of whom we're all proud. To my wife. To the mother of our children. To the legend of the Weasley family. To Mum!" all the children shouted, raising their cups high. Molly stood, and tears appeared in her eyes. Happy tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you all. But remember, I didn't do this for glory or recognition. I did this because I love you. All of you, without exception. And I'll protect this home, this family, as long as I breathe." She looked around at her children, her husband, this old ramshackle kitchen that was the heart of their home. "This is my home," she said quietly but firmly, and each word sounded like an oath. "This is my family, and no one, not gnomes, not dark forces, not anyone else, can take this away. Little Ginny ran to her mother and hugged her tightly. "You're the best mum in the world," she whispered. "And the scariest," Fred added with a wide smile. "And the strongest," Charlie said. "And the smartest," Percy put in. "And the most loving," Arthur finished, embracing his wife. Molly hugged Ginny tightly, then stretched out her arms, and the whole family gathered in one big embrace in the middle of the kitchen. They stood like that, surrounded by warmth, love, and the smell of home cooking. The Weasley family, inseparable, strong, protected by the most powerful magic in the world. And outside the window the garden peacefully dozed under the evening sun. The beds were even, the earth clean, the first sprouts of new vegetables breaking through the soil. Not a single gnome could be seen even on the horizon. Because the gnomes remembered. They remembered the face from the clouds, the silver smoke, the disappearing burrows, and, most importantly, the calm, determined eyes of Molly Weasley. They remembered, and they would never return, because now they knew. Don't mess with Mum Weasley, don't threaten her garden, and most importantly, never underestimate the power of a mother's love. Late in the evening, when everyone had already gone to bed and silence reigned in the house, Fred whispered from his bed, "George? The twin answered sleepily, "I just realized something very important." "What's that?" "When we grow up and start our own families, never, never anger our wives. Because if they're even a little bit like Mum, we're done for." George finished. They were silent, thinking about this thought. "But you know what?" Fred whispered again. "I want my wife to be exactly like that. Strong, brave, able to protect her home and family." "Me too," George agreed. "Because that's who the real boss is here." Fred smiled in the darkness. "Yeah," George smiled too. "That's who the real boss is." And with that thought they fell asleep, and above the burrow shone the stars, the moon illuminated the peaceful garden, and all was well in this small corner of the wizarding world, where the Weasley family lived their noisy, happy, love-filled life. And somewhere far away, beyond the fields and forests, the big gnome was telling his tribe the story of a woman with red hair and a wand who was stronger than any army. And the little gnomelets listened with wide eyes, remembering this lesson for life. A lesson that the strongest magic in the world is love. And that one should never, ever stand in the way of a mother protecting her home.